finished, we're going to finish up our setup lesson by talking about some of our Fabricator options, which affect more of our 2D detailing of our items we have in our model. Now, some of these options do affect things in your model, and we will cover those and talk about what changes to these will affect in your model. And like we stated at the beginning of the training, the setup is something that should be done as a whole at the beginning of the project. We are simply splitting these setup options to when they are most prevalent. So we're going to cover this now before we get into detailing. So to start off with, I'm just going to go to my main menu, and I'm going to go to my job or Fabricator options, and I'm going to have my Fabricator set up here. To start off with, we're going to start with the member and material piece marking options. In this window, there are tabs for your main members, submaterials, group members, and prefixes. And we'll go through all of these. I'm going to bring up my help menu here, so we can go through some of this information. At the very top, we have the option to break major marks apart by. We have the option to not break major marks, break major marks by the number of field bolts on them, break major marks by the sequence they're in, the zone they're in, or make every member an individual member piece mark and not combine anything. Not broken will combine members across the entire project that are similar, and any of the other options like sequence or zone will only combine members within the same sequence or same zone to have the same piece mark. Any identical member in a different zone or sequence would have a different member piece mark to keep them separate. The first checkbox here, to use member mark for member main material and shop bill, this allows you to have in your bill of material your main material of the beam, this W12 by 22 in this case, would get the same B15 as the member in just your bill. If this is unchecked, then it would have just a W12 or whatever the model piece marks are. Now this option will only affect your bill of material. It does not make the change of the piece mark in the model. So checking just this option on, or having this option and another option later on here that actually affects the model, having them both on at the same time has the potential of having your bill of material not match what's actually in your model. So if you're using this, be aware this is only affecting your bill of material. And if you have this option on, you have sub options here to show the sub-material mark for the main material for the different member types. So it's going to be called out as a B15 in the bill, but do you still want the model mark called out here on these main materials on the actual detail? So this is going to be called as W19 in the drawing, but in the bill it would be called out as a B15. The use member mark for member main material and shop bill of stair member details. Again, this works for your stairs. You'll have an L and an R for your left and right main stringers. You can have up to 6 main materials for a stair, so you'd have any returns would be L0 and L1, or R0 and R1 on top of the L and the R for any of the returns. Again, this only affects the bill of materials, so there's a chance these piece marks, if this is checked on, that they will not match the marks in your model. When you have that option turned on for stairs, you can tell it to still show the submaterial mark for main material and the stair member details. This pulls the piece mark from the model and actually labels it as the model piece mark, when your bill of material would still say S109L and R. Next, there's the option for use member mark for member main material in model. If you want this piece marking, this is the option that I suggest that you have on, and only this option. That way, SDS2 will go through and actually create the main materials of your members in your model to match the member piece mark, and then once they're that way in the model, your bill will always be displayed that way. Your bill always matches what's in the model, unless you have one of the options above turned on to only affects the bill of material. So if you like the piece marking to where your main materials have the same piece marks as your member, this is the option that I suggest that you turn on so that your model and your bills are reflecting the exact same information. Now, if you turn this on after you've modeled, you will need to go back into your model and mark everything for processing and reprocess everything. Your piece marking is affected by the process and create solids command. So if you turn this on right now, you'll need to go back and reprocess everything in your model. We also have options here for our handrail. So our system design handrails, we can turn on linear measure for the handrail in the shop bill versus individual pieces. If you want each part called out with lengths, you can do that, or you can get the linear footage for the rails, posts, elbows, and grab bars on their own lines. And then when you have the handrails detailed, you have the option to show submaterial mark for posts on handrails and show submaterial mark for rails on handrails. In our submaterial tab here, our first two options here are for the designation for primary submaterial mark and designation for secondary submaterial mark. This is the first time a mark is called out and any subsequent time the mark is called out on the drawing. By default, it'll always list the material type and piece mark, but you have the options for the primary to list the piece mark only, material type and piece mark, or the material type, size, and piece mark for the first time and any subsequent secondary submaterial marks. Some customers will have the first time called out being called out as a size and piece mark with the type, and then anything after that will just be the piece mark, but you can have that set up for any way that it's called out there. The starting number for material piece marks is the starting number for your piece marks. For example, if it was starting at 100, all of your angles will be called A100 as opposed to A1, depending on how you start that starting number at. The default designation for user-added material callout. This is a tool in SDS2 for the drawing editor, which we'll talk about in the detailing phase, where we can manually label materials that are in the drawing with our own labels, but it'll automatically fill out the information for the label. Do you want that information called out with just the piece mark, the type and piece mark, or the type, size, and piece mark? Once we run it, we can delete whatever we want out of here and just list what we want. But this is going to be the initial filled out information for that command. When we use that command on a bolt, do you want the quantity included on that bolt or not? And for the bolt callout, do you want bolt type only or the bolt size and type? Show submaterial quantity on submaterial details. So when you're detailing a submaterial detail, do you want the total quantity in the model shown at that time, or do you want just the description and the piece mark? Some customers will have a quantity listed. Some will have just the detail and provide a report for the material quantities or how many are on each member, etc. You also have the ability to show member marks and quantities on some material details, so this will tell you how many are on each members. The prefix imperial callouts that are less than 12 inches with a 0 dash. Do you want the inches called out as 0-10 or just 10? This would be 10 inches, but you have the preference of how it's being called out. Break submaterial marks apart by sequence, and include sequence by submaterial mark. So if I have submaterial that are, again, in different sequences, because my members might be sequenced into different sequences, do I want the submaterial, the individual material piece marks, also split by the sequence or by the zone? And then if you do you want a suffix added at the end of the piece mark to list which sequence it's in? So for instance, if I had an A2 in sequence 1, it'd be A2_1. If that same piece mark was split to a different sequence, then it would be called out A5_2. For standard piece marks, like your base plates, or any standard clip angle piece marks, shear tab piece marks, or end plate piece marks, they will always have a suffix added to them if either of these options are checked on. That is the only way for us to keep a standard mark, but also split it by sequence or zone. So you will always see, if we have this checked on for your base plates, for instance, our BP1, if we had that across multiple sequences, in this case, sequence 1 would be BP1_1, and then sequence 2 would be BP1_2. For non-standard marks, you would just get different piece marks, A1 and A5_ whatever sequence they're in. Indicate near side, far side of submaterial on main views. Do I want to indicate near side only, far side only, or the near side, far side both? Show non-standard grade notations with piece marks on member details. So when we call out a plate that's a non-standard, do you want to show the grade of the plate? Or if you have a non-standard call out option, you can call it out as non-standard, or it just won't show the grade. This non-standard was something that be added in your non-standard notation for your steel grade. There's a separate column for a non-standard notation, and it'll include that, or if nothing's filled out, it'll include the actual grade name. Show piece marks for submaterial bolts on member details. So when we're adding our bolts and materials, we can add a bolt as an individual piece of material, so it actually gets a piece mark in your model. Do you want those bolts called out on member details or not? Reuse piece marks is an option that will release any material piece mark once modeling closes that is not in use in the model. We store submaterial piece marks by default in a list, so that if you modeled a plate that got P1, for the entire life of that project then, P1 is always that exact same plate. So if you ever modeled that plate later on, and it comes back in and hadn't been in the model since the first day you were modeling, but you deleted it, it would still get P1 at that time. With this checked on, when you close modeling, P1 gets released and can be reused on a different material when you come back into modeling and start modeling again. A lot of times customers will have this checked on to reuse the piece marks while they're initially modeling, and once they start putting things on sheets or start detailing, they'll uncheck this so the marks are not being released and being reused at later points of the modeling. Force flat bar descriptions to use smaller of length or width. This forces the callouts to always have whatever the smaller side is called out in the description. Show piece marks on all views on member details. This lists the piece marks in every view of a member detail as opposed to just the most prevalent view for the profile of the piece. In our group members, we have the ability to combine all like submembers contained within all group members, or combine all like submembers in the same grouped member piece mark. So whenever a member gets grouped into a larger group member, that submember piece mark will not combine with anything that's not in a group member. So if I have two beams, one's in a group, one's not in a group, and they're identical, they will have different piece marks. One's a member, one's a submember piece mark. Of all submembers in all group members, do you want them to be all the same piece mark or have a different piece mark for each different group member piece mark? The use member mark for member main material in shop bill of group member details. When you group a member into a larger group, the main materials will get a submaterial piece mark. Do you want those submaterial piece marks to be called out in the bill of material for the group member, or do you want those main materials of the submembers to have the B_69, B_63, etc. piece marks in the bill? Again, this only affects the bill of material. It does not affect the model piece marks of that group. Use group mark for main submembers main material mark in model. This uses whatever the group member piece mark is, and it passes it down to the submember and then to that submember's main material. So you'll see that the group member here is a GM127, and this W6x15 was the main member for that group, and its main material, the W6x15, gets the group member piece mark in the model and in the bill. And then lastly, our prefixes. This is where we can set our default material piece mark prefixes and description prefixes. So in our angles, for example, you have an A prefix. So you would have an A5 for a piece of angle. The description for an angle is always going to be from the material file, so you'd have your L 4x4x1/4 as the description for the angle. So by material type, you can set the material prefixes here for all your submaterial. For anything that's not in the material file, for instance, plate, round bar, flat bar, etc., you have both a piece mark prefix as well as a description prefix. So if I have plate and bent plate, and I wanted my bent plate to have a different prefix for the description of the material than my regular plate, I could change this to BPL or BNT as the description, whatever you want to be called out for the description of that plate, and that would affect the auto description in the model, like we saw in lesson 9 for our modeling phase 3, where we can affect the material description in the model. we can set what those default auto descriptions are generating as the prefix for both the piece mark and the description of those. Those are your member material piece marking options that help control all the piece marking in the model. And again, you're going to want to change these at the beginning of the project so that everything is done from that point forward with the correct piece marking. If you come back and realize that a description or a prefix needs a change, you will need to make the change here and go back into your model and make sure that you actually regenerate everything and not just reprocess everything. There's multiple steps that you need to go into updating all the piece marks, because any changes here only affect new material that does not match existing material in your project. If you have any issues where you need to change the piece marking, you'll want to make the changes here and go back into the model, and we'll have to do a few things to do that. I recommend contacting support if you have any questions on how to make your piece marks update. A quick way to do that is set everything existing and releasing all your piece marks through your release submaterial marks, and then setting them all back to not existing, and then it'll go back through and re-piece mark and redo the descriptions on everything. Material descriptions are where we can set the member descriptions. So for our member details, what is the description on the member detail? It'll say 1 beam B15 or 1 column C15. What do we want those prefixes to say here? Then you also have your default miscellaneous descriptions. If you remember when we added our miscellaneous bent plate, I could pick a description from a list. This is where that list is generated from. So if you had pour stop or you had other miscellaneous members that you were modeling, you could set up the default descriptions here and just have a list to pick from as you're modeling those miscellaneous members. And piece mark prefixes, this is the system member prefix for a beam. By default, it's B underscore. If you don't like the underscore or you want a dash or something like that for your system prefixes, go ahead and just change those here. The sheet auto loading is when we get to detailing or loading them on sheets, we have a member type description. This is the auto loading type description for each member type, so it will automatically fill in this as the placeholder for the member type description when you're auto loading and auto changing the piece marks to the sheet marks when you actually get them loaded. Next, we'll go to our detailing options here. We're going to go to our dimensioning criteria. For our dimensioning criteria under the General tab, we have the options to use dimension terminals. We want arrows or slashes. Submaterial sloping hole layout dimensions. Do you want the layout dimensions going to the furthest hole, on the work line, or on the nearest hole? Or you can set it to none and it won't get those layout dimensions. Main material sloping hole layout dimensions. These are holes on the main materials themselves. You have the same options. Furthest hole, work line, nearest hole, or none. Main material sloping hole extension dimensions. Do you want extension dimensions ran to any of the 4 corners of a hole group for sloping holes on the main material? You can have any of the 4 of these checked on and or off. Show point-to-point distance on main dimension. This shows your point-to-point distance right here, which is work point to work point. Do you want this shown as a check reference, or you can uncheck this and it will not be shown? Steel grade on material on main dimension. Do you want the steel grade listed there or not? When I add an arc length dimension, do I want the radius provided for that arc length dimension or not? I can show the angle for my arc length dimensions as well. I can show it as degrees, radians, or degrees, minutes, seconds. Degrees is a decimal degrees. Break lines at label interference. Do I want to see my lines here broken if I have label crossing over them, or do I want them running right behind the back of it? I can also break material lines, which are your polygons and actual material edges in the model. Break bevel lines. Combine dimensions across detail. This will combine hole groups and any bolts and holes that are close to each other, and it'll combine them across multiple groups. Otherwise, you'll get separate dimensions for each group. Do I want extension dimensions on submaterial details? Do I want to have an extension dimension here to this furthest point, or just get my normal dimensions? Extension dimension tails on submaterial detail. So the tails are going to be a horizontal extension dimension pointing back towards the work point here. If I turn tails off, they'll just run vertically with the hole location. Material point holdback distance. This is the distance from the actual point is dimensioning for the extension lines. Where do I want those held back from? And then do I want to lock the outline layer? These are your polygons and the material edges. This is checked. You cannot delete them in the drawing. You have to come in and uncheck this to be able to delete any of these outlines. And lock manual editing of dimension text. This prevents system-generated dimensions from being modified by a user in that drawing, unless again you come in here and unlock this in your setup options. Then you have display measurement unit for angle dimensions. Do you want them displayed as degrees or as radians? And then what precision? This is the number of decimals. This is 1 decimal precision. This is 4 decimal precision. For beam specifically, you have the option to show extension dimensions on the beam details, show extension dimension tails on beam details or not, show the extension dimension origin, dimension reference point on symmetrical web holes. So if I have a hole group here, do I want a dimension to the center of it? And same thing for flange holes. Do I want a symmetrical flange hole reference? Show chain dimensions between hole groups. Do I want the dimension between all the hole groups? Show extension dimensions from the left or the right end of the view. Extension dimensions from when I have a bolted condition. Do I want it from the end of the beam or the face of the connection? And if it's a welded connection, do I want it from the end of the beam or the face of the connection? And if I have a cope on the end of a member, do I want the cope dimension taken from the end of the beam or the face of the connection for that end? And when my extension dimensions are taken from the end of the material, do I want to show the end of beam to face of clip angle dimension there? For columns, there are going to be a lot of the same options. I can show extension dimensions, have tails turned on. I can show the origin symbol, symmetrical web holes and flange holes, chain dimensions between hole groups, show extension dimensions from the top or bottom of the column. And for my extension dimensions, do I want that at the top of the plate or the bottom of the base plate? And for my overall dimensions, for the cap plate, do I want taken from the top of the cap plate or bottom of the cap plate for my overall dimension here? And the same with my base plate, where I want the overall dimension shown from. For bracing, both horizontal and vertical have the exact same options. I have the ability to show extension dimensions, show tails, my origin symbol or not, symmetrical web and flange holes, as well as the chain dimensions between hole groups. And do I want to show extension dimensions from left or right end? Lastly, on the miscellaneous, I have the option to show extension dimensions on my miscellaneous member details. When I'm using specifically a rolled plate material type, this is a specific type of material in the model. Do I want the lengths generated taken from the outside, center, or inside of that rolled plate? And when I have a bent plate, so my bent plate material type, how do I want my length calculated for that plate? By default, SDSU will always go at the center line of the material. So your lengths are always taken from the center line of the bends and from the thickness of the material. If you had a different location you wanted your length taken from, based on the thickness of the bent plate, you can use a custom K-factor. The K-factor is a ratio from the inside face to the outside face. So a 0.5 or 50% ratio is dead center. 0 is on the inside face and 1 is on the outside face of your bent plate. So you can see here in setup, by default, we have a range that from 0 to ½ inch, we have a K-factor of 0.35, and as it gets thicker, it goes to the inside face. You can customize this to whatever you want. If you always want taken from the inside face of a bent plate, you can have the thickness ranges of 0 to 10 inch thick plate always be at 0, and it'll always come from the inside face of that bent plate. And when we have bent materials, we get the unfolded surface templates. For bend lines, do we want to show beginning and ending bend lines or just the center line? And then for those bend lines, the beginning, center, and end line, you can choose specifically the pen color to use and the line type to use for those bend lines. Drawing cosmetics is where we define a lot of the actual visual aspect of our drawings. So for sizes, we have our labels, which are any label added to the drawing. This height is in millimeters, 4.9 millimeters. It'll always be in millimeters regardless of what your units are in for the job. The width to height ratio is just a ratio from how wide it is compared to how tall it is. So 0.4 is the standard. If you make that larger, it's going to make it look wider like this, or narrower if you make it smaller. The labels are any label added by the system. Your section size and piece mark character heights are the section size and piece marks on your erection view details. These are going to be the member labels for all of your members on your erection views. Your weld symbol character height, how high do you want the default text height to be for your weld symbols? And then the size of the terminals. This is technically a scale, or a ratio if you will. 1 is always going to be 1:1 for the scale of the drawing. 2 will always be twice as big as the default. And you have the same thing for your arrow pointers on just like any pointer added to the model as opposed to a dimension. And then lastly also your work point symbols. You can scale those up or down as well from a 1 to any size you want there as a ratio. For our fonts, these are the default fonts used for label fonts. This is any label added to the drawing. Dimension label fonts. So you have both a font and a font style. Font styles are things like bold, narrow, italic, etc. The default for SDS2 2020 is the homofont, but you can change to any standard font list you have in your Windows Fonts folder. You have your symbols fonts, so any type of font used for weld symbols, bevel symbols. You also have your member labels font. What fonts do you want for all your member labels? So these are anything that are not your piece marks or section sizes, things like end elevations or camber notes. You have specifically options for your member piece mark label fonts and member section size label fonts. And then you have bill of material font and your sheet revision chart font. So what fonts do you want to use for your bill of material and for your revision charts? These are the default fonts. You can modify these on the sheet after it's been placed. If you want a special font for a specific sheet, you can always do that manually. Pens are the pen number used for each type of label. We'll see here in the next window our drawing pen setup affects what those pen numbers actually plot as far as color and thickness. And this is where we just pick which pens are used in which situations. So we have our bill label pen. This is the actual information filled out within the bill. Our detailing label pen, you can see in green here. These labels are the labels that would be affected in a drawing. You have your pointer pen, the section size on your erection views, and piece marks on erection views. What pens do you want used here? And then you have your member pen color. This affects the pen number used for drawing the member lines in both the erection view details as well as your model. So changing your pen number here will also affect the color your member lines are in your model. By default, this is red, but you could change it to any of the 7 pen colors, and your stick lines would come in that color in your model as well. You have your cloud pen, your weld pen, dimension color pen, bevel color pen, your grid line bubble pen color. This affects the colors that the line and the bubbles come in. Your filled hole pen color. Hatch pen color. Your member detail pen color. This is going to be your wire outline of any sort of material details when you're showing wire. The bill of material also has specific setups for the spaces between fields in the bill of material, 1 or 2. This is the horizontal number of spaces between the columns, running left and right across the columns. Bill items, character height, and width height ratios. Do you want to defaultly show your bill of material grid or not? Do you want to wrap fields in text? This will wrap the line to the next line. You can see in this case, instead of having it run past, it'll wrap it down into separate lines. Extend foot-inch separator. This puts the foot-inch separator up into this header here. Otherwise, if it's unchecked, it just leaves it as a blank field here for the second line of the header. Default rotation of your bill of material when you're adding it. The outside pen color is the border color. Inside pen color is the grids of the bill of material itself. Maximum spacing between items. This is the maximum space allowed between bill items vertically. This will condense as needed down to the minimum of 2 rows. Your minimum number of rows for your bill of material. This is what your bill of material will start at when you first add it onto the sheet. And then your maximum number of rows is the maximum number of rows it'll expand to as you add items to the bill of material on the sheet. If you never want it to collapse or expand the bill, you set it to the same number, and it'll always come in and say the exact same number of lines. The title text is the default text in the header of the bill of material. Then you have your character height width ratio for that, the font for the title font, as well as the header font, which are these header lines here beneath the title. And the same thing for your revision charts. You have show grid, wrap fields of the revision charts, number of lines for the default revision chart as you place it. Do you want the header position at the top of the revision chart or the bottom of the revision chart? And do you want your revision chart filled from top to bottom or bottom to top? The default rotation when adding a revision chart to your sheets, and the default anchor point for when you're adding a revision chart to your sheet. You also have your default character height, height width ratio, the column title font, font styles, outside pen color, inside pen color for your revision tables. We also have the same thing for just tables. Tables are an item you can add to your sheet, which we'll look at here when we're going through Drawing Editor, that you can manually fill out information to just a table, or you can have reports that actually fill out the table automatically for you. This is going to control the outside and inside pen colors, the default rotation when you're adding a table, what the anchor point when you're adding a table is, do I want to show grid or not. Now there's the same information here for your header and the body of that table. So you have fonts, font style, the justification, the character height and width height ratio, as well as what pen color you want that to be. So you have the header and then your body of those tables. Our primary dimensions is where we can set what the primary dimension of our modeling is. This also affects the detailing. So if I need to change the metric, I could do that here, and that would affect the units used in both modeling and detailing. Lock primary units. If this is checked, no matter what I type in for the entered value, it'll always display in the primary units that I have selected here. So if I put in 140 millimeters, it always stores the same internal decimal value, but with lock primary units unchecked, it'll actually display 140 millimeters if I were to edit that piece again. Otherwise, it'll say 5.5 if I say lock it, because it'll find the closest displayed precision and round it to that displayed locked primary unit. You also have your default character height and width ratio for your primary dimensions. And when we're detailing and putting in a dimension less than a specific value, do you want it to expand that dimension here when it's less than a specific value here? By default, it's 5/16 of an inch. It'll try to expand it here to see those arrows better or the slashes better. Our dimension precision is the displayed precision in our details and the rounded precision in modeling for different fields. By default, that is a 1/16 of an inch. You can go down to a 32nd of an inch, and that's what it'll display in precision in both the detailing and in the model. Again, remember, you can always right-click in any field in the model to get the actual stored decimal value versus what the dimensional precision rounding is. And then lastly, we have our dimension label pen colors. So for the dimension label text here, what do we want our pen number to be? So we have the same sort of options here for secondary dimensions. This allows us to add secondary dimensions to the bottom side of our dimension lines. So for instance, if I wanted to show secondary dimensions and have metric shown as a secondary dimension, I could do that. You have the same option for character height, width ratio, and pen number. And then lastly, we have our default layer colors. Layer colors are the layers that are displayed in your drawing editor and also in your PDFs. By default, the only layer that has a color assigned to it is user adjusted. We'll show more about this in detailing of how when we affect a system annotation that changes the meaning of the drawing, it'll switch it to a user adjusted layer, making it red as you see here. Those colors can be turned off in user options. If you have your user options here, user and site options, if I go into my drawings tab, I have the option to show layer colors in drawing editor. This will show the layer colors that I set there in drawing editor by default. And then also my output tab, I have the option to show layer colors in PDFs. So if I want to show layer colors as I print my PDFs or not, you can check that on or off as well. This is typically used for checking, so a checker can see what a detailer changed that was a system annotation that you would have adjusted to make it a user adjusted annotation. In my drawing pen setup, this is where I can define my plotted pen width in millimeters and the color in which that those pens actually send to the plotter. Now, pen 0 is a system pen that we use to fill holes and things like that. This does not need to be adjusted because you cannot set this within any of your drawing editor options. Pen 1 through 7 are what are to set in your drawing editor options. And so if I wanted to say pen 1, I wanted to actually plot green, I could change this slider here, and this is the color that that pen will actually be sent to the plotter with. By default, they're all black, except for pen number 6, where it's just a really dark gray. So you can make these really light gray or dark gray. If these numbers all match, then it'll be a gray of some sort. So if I wanted this to be a little bit lighter, let's just go 50, 50, 50, and then it's a little bit lighter gray. General detailing fabrication options. This is where I can set my default member scale and default submaterial detail scale. And then I also have a field here by nominal size. What do I want my default scale to be? So if I had a bunch of small beams like W6s and 8s, I can make the scale larger than 1. And if I had a bunch of W40s and 44s, I can make them smaller than 1 to change the detailing scale depending on the actual nominal size of the section. The edge distance detailed dimensioning options. Anytime I have an edge distance in my detail, I can specify a standard distance. So 1.5 inches here is specified as a standard edge distance. Anytime there is a hole that is 1.5 inches from an edge, SDS2 will consider it a standard edge distance and not dimension it. If I want anything that is not a standard edge distance to be shown, I can check on this option and it'll dimension only things that are not 1.5 inches. If I uncheck these checkboxes, no standard edge distance will get dimensioned. If I want all edge distances dimensioned, I would set this to something that would not be relevant, like 0, and then check this on, and then all edge distances will be dimensioned in your details. Our shop bill weights, we have the ability to show shop weight precision, and this is a 1 pound precision. You can also go up to 0.01 as a precision. Do you want to always round weights up? In this case, if you ran to a full pound and it was 4.4, it would round up to 5 pounds. Do I want the weights to always add up, or actual total weights? So you can see that here I have a quantity of multiple where I have the weight for the unit itself, and the total weight is a multiplication of the quantity versus unit. The actual totals sums each, both the unit and the total weight, and rounds them separately versus making them a multiple. And then do you want your shop bill weight based on volume or dimension? Volume looks at the actual solids in the model and removes any cuts, copes, holes from the actual volume and calculates the weight based on that. Dimension is simply the dimension of the piece times the weight per foot or the weight of the plates, and it'll give you a weight based on just the general dimension of the plate. Typically, this is referred to as an fabricated weight for the volume, and this is just the dimension weight or the non-fabricated weight. And this is what you basically have to buy. This is the weight after it's been created. What do you want the bill weight to show as? Show cross-section hatching. If you have a cross-section here, do you want to show hatching in it? And if you have a cut surface, in this case there's a little cope here, do you want your cut surface to also show this hatching or not? When I have a view that shows holes on the opposite faces, so A and C are the flanges near side and far side in this case, or like columns, you have a flange near side and flange far side. Do you want to see the holes on the opposite face when you're looking at a flange on one side or the other? Do you want to see those or do you not want to see those? Show main member size information. And do you want to not show the K distance specifically? Show submaterial layout dimensions on member details. So it'll show you a layout dimension here for this piece of submaterial. Show shop bolted slotted holes. So if I have shop bolted materials here that are bolted together, do I care about showing that there's a slot in this piece or not? And if I do, what is the minimum slot length I want shown? Do I want to use curved pointers by default or not? And do I want to use pointer face indicators by not? If I'm pointing to a face, do I want to use the face indicator or not? And when I have a single quantity designation on the main callout, do I want it listed as the word 1 or the number 1? We'll wrap up this Fabricator setup video here, and we'll continue on in the next video.